3, touching on our first industry insight. How do you guys feel about that? I mean, I feel like people are going to view us like we're almost experts on a topic.
We most certainly are not experts on a topic, but we've been around enough to know a little bit, to be dangerous.
We can talk about it. Yeah,
we have a discussion about it, and that's just, I mean, no one's really an expert.
No, but I think part of this, the industry insight, the mantra we're going for here is we're going to do our homework, right? And we're going to understand a problem as it sits, talk about a few solutions, the current way of doing things. What was the old way of doing things? What's the future look like? I think with this first one, we've kind of highlighted one that's, I guess, seasonal in nature, but I think also we're at a point in time now where it's literally like an epidemic, and we're talking about the antibiotic crisis. Do either of you want to take a stab at the overarching?
Sure, I'll go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so as most of you probably know, that over the last several decades, antibiotics have been overprescribed for a lot of reasons. They're obviously miracle drugs. They save tons of lives. They're very useful and should continue to be used. But unfortunately, they're seen kind of as a fix-all and the go-to every time somebody comes in with a sniffle or a cold or whatever it may be. A doctor writes a script for an antibiotic. And just like the opioid crisis that you're all familiar with, and they've been overprescribed, and there's the issues there, I'm sure we'll talk about sometime. But antibiotics are just as bad. So things like pneumonia and tuberculosis, there's resistant strains of those that the current antibiotics cannot fix right now or cannot treat. So that's a big problem, and it'll continue to get worse and worse. There'll be other diseases that can't be treated that were typically otherwise treated with antibiotics. So there's something out there called the antimicrobial stewardship that a lot of doctors, the CDC, have initiated in order to kind of temper down the writing of these antibiotics when they're only necessary. Well, because when they're necessary, you can write them, but they're overprescribed for people that really don't need them written for them.
So what I think is you got a situation where, as patients, we don't, I can speak for myself as a patient, I didn't know the difference between a virus and bacteria at one point before I was really into medical. So I would want to walk in as an individual and just get a pill, right? Yep. I walk into the office, I get a pill, I go home, it fixes it. Yeah, and unfortunately that's why I have an opioid issue as well, So you got two things at play right there right now that I think are really causing a bit of an issue. And now that's a major issue. And as somebody that has kids and soon to have, it's that is where I think it's really scary because it's happening at such a young age.
Why do we think? I think the average listener, right? We everybody knows about the opioid epidemic. Why do we think that this hasn't got as much press and or light to this kind of problem here?
Well, sorry.
I was going to say I think the sensationalism comes from a lot of the opioid addiction overdose issues with a lot of the famous folks that bring attention to it. You may get Prince, and Michael Jackson, and what was her name, Whitney.
Well, and people aren't dying right on the spot from taking an antibiotic or not taking an antibiotic in a lot of cases, and it's not as dramatic, unfortunately. But this is a problem that's building and building over time. The more and more antibiotics people take, the more and more resistant these diseases are becoming. And it's going to be a real big problem in the near future when people get sick and the antibiotics that used to work for them don't work any longer.
Which is interesting because the way to fix a problem like this is education, right? I mean, you think about how we got here, right? I mean, you think about growing up, at least for me, like my grandmother, I remember having that pink liquid in the refrigerator, and we had it. It didn't matter what your problem was.
Peppermint, right?
Mine was bubble gum, but it didn't matter what the issue was. It was headache, it was stomach ache, it was whatever. It's like go get a couple spoonfuls. Like that's just what it was. Little did we know,
is the go-to.
Every spoonful was contributing to where we stand today, which the World Health Organization literally quotes as a global health crisis, and that's almost an unbelievable statement. Something that's so powerful. Joe mentioned has now been turned on its head, and now all of a sudden we're facing a severe problem.
And I actually don't think it's getting enough awareness that it needs, to be honest with you. Where it's going to become a problem is when you have, like, I don't know, a situation like the movie Outbreak. You got the Mutaba virus that's just wiping out people, or people are turning into zombies. But those are obviously Hollywood sensationalized types of things.
Sure.
But the CDC claims they got stuff locked up down in the basement that could wipe us all out. Like that.
Sure, and you've seen them start that antimicrobial stewardship, so obviously there's some attention being paid to it. But also you've seen some payers, some insurance companies, they're not reimbursing doctors if they have a code in there that doesn't reflect or warrant the need for an antibiotic, and they actually prescribe one. So reimbursement is being affected as well.
Yeah. So before you dive into more, because I want to ask you about that in a second, I mean, let's talk about the current model, right? So what's happening today versus what should be happening? I think I'll start because we've studied this quite a bit. It's today you walk into a physician's office. It doesn't matter what the setting is, and you're given a rapid flu test. You present with some type of symptom, whatever it may be, that looks like respiratory, upper respiratory, it looks like flu. Okay, so the first thing that happens is you get a rapid flu test. You can buy them from McKesson of the world for $8 or $10, and it just gives you a qualitative answer on yes or no. The problem lies in the no answer, right? So if you get a yes, great. You probably get something that treats flu specifically that's not an antibiotic, right? Because we should know that flu does not warrant antibiotic. But then the answer for the no, now all of a sudden, what does the physician do? Okay, so again, Joe's talking about physicians are busy, maybe uneducated in some cases, overworked, as you touched on. What do we do with this patient, right? Well, without the proper laboratory diagnostic testing, you're essentially guessing, right? And unfortunately, I think we see that
Not essentially, they are guessing.
They are guessing. And too often in medicine, I think that may be true until the appropriate specificity is applied through a diagnostic. So patient leaves with or without antibiotic, doesn't feel any better, and in most cases returns, because we know for a fact it increases cost and hospital stays, and we know that for a fact.
Yep.
So, that's where we stand. So patient's frustrated, doctor didn't make any money, and now all of a sudden everybody loses this entire circle. And that's not a good spot to be in.
Yeah, no, it's a difficult balance. I mean, we don't understand from the physician side, but soon we'll have a physician on here to kind of ask them the balance between, you've got a patient in front of you that has a need that they want to get, taken care of right then and there, versus what's the right clinical decision at that moment, right?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So, and I would imagine they were taught or should more often lean in that direction. But when you've got somebody in front of you, like, doc, just write me something.
Yeah.
It's definitely
And they have a backlog of 5 or 6 patients they have to see.
Exactly.
It's an easy thing to do.
It's a quick and easy thing to do so we can understand how it happened. And I'm not sure there was a lot of data probably early on about the issues with antibiotics. Now there's more of that coming out. So now what, right? So you kind of, what I think we want to talk about a little bit more in depth today is okay, so what's the solution for that? What are physicians doing, and what other opportunities do we have out there that could really, given we're walking here on the precipice of flu season, what opportunities do we have to really offer true value in that area?
Yeah, I think it's obviously twofold, and I'll walk into that trap of respiratory pathogen testing is obviously number one. But I think that's paired with, and we can discuss that a little bit too, is about patient education along with that, right? Mm-hmm. So the best way to educate a patient is to, in my opinion, once the test is ran, you get them involved in their care, right? You show them the report, you show them results, you talk about action plans, et cetera. So that the diagnostic we're referencing is a respiratory pathogen panel, and essentially what we're discussing is just a basic lab test that is offered at most labs that we deal with now, and most labs around the country, and obviously most hospital labs too, where we're identifying the difference based on the DNA from the nose, the difference between a bacteria and a virus, right? And so that providers now know, so we talk about knowing versus guessing, they now know specifically which virus, if it is, which bacteria, if it is, and then can prescribe therapies accordingly. That's what we're really touching on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, no, and as we talked about, so there's 2 different kinds of the RPP test, right? So you have the one that's traditionally sent out to the lab, and you have to wait for a 24 or 48 hour turnaround. But there's the new one now that we've seen that's actually the in-office testing, where they bring the box inside the office and they get a result within 45 minutes or an hour. So there's 2 models there, and the one in office we've seen some success with, because doctors can get that result and that clinical information they need to make the right decision within a short period of time.
Yeah. I was just going to say the other benefit I think it produces in the model Joe's referencing is if unfortunately I don't know that patient care is enough every time. Right? So if I just bring a product to a physician,
you wish it would be, right?
That says this is the best you could do for your patient. I wish that's a yes, 10 out of 10. But the truth of the matter just isn't. And it's not necessarily their fault either, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the healthcare space we find ourselves in. But now if I can incentivize a physician, payers can incentivize a physician, now all of a sudden we start seeing change.
Sure.
Right? And that's why I think we've seen that model kind of really get some traction.
Yeah, and let's talk about the model for a second, right? So I think it's probably best to describe the model. We kind of go over the old way in which it was done, which we touched on a little bit for a second, but I'll talk about the old way, and when you guys talk about the new way. The old way was, all right, so Derek's not feeling really well. He's got sniffles, he's coughing, and he goes to see his physician, right? Whether it be a internist, whether it be a pediatrician, if I was younger, or maybe I'm going to see an urgent care center, something like that. Probably, yeah. Yes. So once I walk in, I've come there because I don't feel well and I want a solution. That's where some of those pressures come into play. Sure. So I'll walk into the physician and I'll say, hey, I don't feel good. They'll fill your nodes, maybe a rapid flu test. And essentially, if they don't do that, they're making a guess, whether it's viral or bacterial. Yep. And literally, nearly every time I've ever asked for an antibiotic, because I would, I would get one. Yeah. I would go home with that, and sometimes I would get better, and sometimes I wouldn't. But to me, at that moment, I thought, hey, might as well take a shot at it. It's like a 50-50 shot, right? Yep. Yeah. So, that being said, that's the current experience. But some of the physicians that see the value in the RPP test or the respiratory pathogen panel test is they will go ahead and they'll stick that pharyngeal swab up my nose, and from that be able
How
to.
does that feel when it happens?
I actually haven't had one, but I've watched the training video, and definitely they're wincing.
It looks like it goes to your brain.
It does.
It's definitely not a comfortable thing. I think you can actually taste the Q-tip. That's how far up your nose as it is. So the reality is that I get that very uncomfortable, like roto-rooter, pharyngeal swab thing done, and then from there, it gets sent off to a lab. Now that's good science, right? Mm-hmm. In that situation, it's like docs kind of gives me a pat in the ass and says, "Hey, go home, and we'll call you tomorrow because it goes to a lab. You don't get it back until the next day." So good
best.
science at best,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I guess in that scenario, what would they do? Call like CVS, and if it was bacterial, they would call it in.
Yeah,
I really need to come
or they
back
just
in.
give you one of their their go-to antibiotics for the day, and then start you potentially on something tomorrow, or take it away from you. Basically, so you leave with the therapy, although it not be right, then you just wait for the result. I mean, there's a couple ways to do it, but that's
I
one.
guess it depends on the physician. So
Sure.
from there, it's not the greatest from the patient's perspective, but it's good science. So it's an improvement as we speak about an antibiotic
question.
crisis. So talk about sort of the new way, and then we'll get into the science of it, and we'll get into really how the program sort of works. I think it's phenomenal going into flu season.
Yeah, so the new way is not too different than the old way you described, right? So the new way is still the swab up the nose. They're going to take the test, but in this new model, the diagnostic machine is actually in the office, right? So they can actually take the sample, put it in the box, run it, and it takes about 45 minutes to an hour to actually get the result, and the result's right there. So the experience of the patient's much better because the patient can go out in the waiting room, sit there, watch TV, or flip through a magazine, and then have the result, and then either leave their prescription, or if they have to go back to work, they can call it in that day, and they have something tangible. They have a fix. They have an answer right then and there.
And that's awesome for the patient's perspective.
Sure.
The science is still intact, right? So that's an improvement about the last model.
And then talk about that.
Yeah, but talk about the science actually, because I think it's great, for the physician, it's great for the patient, but like talk about CDC recommendations, PCR testing, and all.
Yeah, I mean, the
everything that goes into
PCR
that.
technology that we're referencing is really what's recommended. I mean, the CDC went as far as saying if you're trying to make a clinical decision, the one that matters, which I don't know many that don't, that the rapid flu test just isn't enough. Right. This was no different than in urine drug testing when people are relying on those $3 plastic cups
that you can buy at Walgreens.
No question that you test your family on if you expect something, right? So
exactly.
This is no different. So again, I use the pregnancy analogy all the time. I mean, we're talking about knowing versus guessing. My wife takes a pregnancy test, which she just did 6 months ago, found out we're having a baby, but then she goes and paints the room pink just based off the things she bought at Walgreens, right?
For $2. Yeah.
That's what we're talking. So we're acting upon information as if it's the gospel when we know for a fact the false negative and positive rate is significant. Mm-hmm. So I mean, not only are you getting the specificity, not only are you getting at the point of care, not only is the physician now making money doing it. That's the perfect. Now, is it as specific as if you send it off to a high quality laboratory? In some cases, no, but it's CLIA waived, meaning that most offices can offer it. If they're drawing blood, they can do this. So it's more accessible to those providers, right? And it's done in a way where it's not terribly, we'll call it burdensome when it comes to financial capital. And the final, I guess, where all this comes together, and we don't really see this in healthcare a lot, where basically you have insurance payers, the U.S. government, some of the major health organizations and programs they've put into play, physicians
CDC.
and patients all wanting the same thing. I mean, think about it in healthcare when we've had all those things lined up for us. It's
doesn't
not
happen
often.
often, yeah, no.
So that's awesome because when you go to implement a program that you have like that, you have you talk about a name drop. You name anybody; they're all on this page. You're not contradicting science or insurance companies, or usually when you sell a product, it's one of those parties doesn't believe.
Someone's fighting you.
No doubt. So I think that right there is good. We're going to see serious growth and actually more tests come to the point of care. That way, though, so it's gonna be really cool to watch.
This will be the new standard of care, right? When it comes to flu season, this will be what everyone does when a patient comes in because it's the right way to do it.
That's
and
right.
like you said, you have the alignment. So I mean, I'm super excited about the program because it's been something that's been out there for a while. Now we have more alignment, but now it's an accessible model, so it's something that we can really do really well with.
Mm-hmm. No question.
And the physicians can really benefit as
We've
well.
done pretty well with it too.
Yes, we have. Yeah. Awesome. Well, that being said, this is our first industry insight. Appreciate you listening, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.